this video, we're going to move on to the first two phases of the singer's phrase that we spoke about in the last video, the inhale and the transition to exhale. So what I want to do in this video is I first want to explain why this is important. And then, because we can't see inside of our belly while we're breathing, we're going to do a type of exercise in imagination so we can imagine what's happening. We might add some vocabulary to describe what's happening, but nothing too complicated. And then we'll move on to doing some exercises, first with the inhale, both inhaling correctly and incorrectly in a few different ways to really get a feel for what's the appropriate way to inhale while preparing to sing or speak a phrase. And then we'll move into the transition to exhale, and we'll do some exercises there as well. So now let's talk about why is the inhale and transition to inhale important? Well, one of the most important things that separates a master or an advanced singer or speaker from a beginner is that they begin, it's very important to begin each phrase correctly, to move through the phase correctly, and to complete it correctly. So what is correctly? Well, each part of the instrument has a way to be activated and prepared to begin each phrase and to perform through the phrase all the way through the phrase. So for example, in the air production, we have certain muscles that need to be active. We need to have the breath in place. And again, each part has, up here in the resonator, there's a lot of muscles that need to be active and pulled upward and backward. We'll talk about that later. But when each of the three parts of the instrument are active at the start of a phrase, the phrase begins very easily. The pitch is accurate. The tone comes out good. And as long as we remember to keep all that activity appropriate through the very end of the phrase, then we're fine. Then we have a quick recovery on the inhale and we're at it again. So what beginners tend to do is they tend to not start the phrase properly, so they're playing catch up. They're playing catch up, and quite often, if you're singing at a high pitch or in your high end of your range, you can't even recover. You start the phrase so poorly that there's all that squeezing or the pitch is inaccurate, and there's no way to recover. Sometimes you might start it properly and get through it, but a lot of times a beginner tends to let everything end too soon. They lose the support during the phrase, or they let all the good muscle activation up here in the head sort of fall and relax too soon. Okay, so what we're trying to do is, in this lesson, we're talking about air production. So we're trying to talk about how do we prepare this to be ready for the role it's going to play in producing a phrase. Okay, now let's go into this exercise in imagination. So we breathe, we pull in air. Obviously, the air fills in our lungs, and many of you are already students of voice. The primary muscle involved in the inhalation, the taking in of air, is the diaphragm muscle. And what happens is the diaphragm sits underneath the lungs, and it's a pulling muscle. It pulls down, and it begins to stretch the lungs and creates a type of vacuum pressure such that air is drawn in or pulled into the lungs. Okay, so and then the muscle just lets go and relaxes, and it returns, as you exhale, it returns to its resting position. Okay, so the shape of the diaphragm, I want you to why don't we do this? Imagine that I'm holding an umbrella. Okay, so I've got the lower handle of the umbrella in my hand, and the stem is coming up here, and you've got the top of the umbrella is curved upward here. Well, that's the diaphragm in its resting position, is it's slightly arced upward like an umbrella. So now in this imagination exercise, instead of the stem of the handle going up to the center of the umbrella, imagine that it actually connects somewhere on the outer edge of the umbrella. Okay, so now you have the stem connecting to the outer edge, but you still have the umbrella arced over. Okay, so now where the stem was connected in the middle, imagine that there's a rope connected to that center point such that you can pull down on the rope. You're still holding the handle, you're holding the umbrella, But as you pull down on the rope, instead of the sides of the umbrella collapsing like they usually do, imagine that the tip of the umbrella gets pulled down and the umbrella moves, it flips. It becomes, instead of being, again, like the diaphragm, instead of being here, it actually flips upside down and becomes arced upside down. Okay, so you're holding this handle, you're pulling this rope, and then you let go, and the umbrella has sort of its own spring mechanism where it pops back up, and now it's round again. So you have this round surface, you pull down on it, it becomes inverted, you let go, and it pops up. And then the only other thing to add to this imagination exercise is imagine it that this rope, instead of hanging freely, just imagine that it's tied to the handle right above my hand. Okay, so it's tied to the handle. So when I pull on the rope, I'm really pulling at a slight angle toward the handle, but it's still pulling this umbrella top down. Okay, and that's essentially how the diaphragm operates. So the diaphragm muscle is not only the dome part, but it actually has muscle fiber that move down at an angle and connect to your lower spine on the inside, of course, not here in the back where it wraps around it, but it's on the inside. And that muscle is a contracting muscle. So what it's doing is it's pulling down, creating a vacuum in your lungs, air is being drawn in, and then it simply relaxes and bounces back up into place. And then it gets repeated. Okay, so what else can we add to this? Because there's something very interesting that happens here is that now imagine this little diaphragm umbrella inside your gut. Well, what happens is this space underneath, when it's in the up position, the space underneath isn't empty. It actually contains the contents of your gut, the organs, your stomach, and of course there's contents below as well. So when you're pulling down on an inhale, it's pushing down. The diaphragm actually has to push through that. It has to push through the contents of your gut, and they need some place to go. Okay, so when it pushes down, the guts go downward, and you start feeling more of an outward pressure because they have no place to go. In the back, because you have your spinal column there and some pretty thick muscles, there's really no way at all to go there. So what happens is the contents of your gut are going to feel like the pressure is moving out forward and diagonally from the lower base of your gut. So what can happen is if that muscle is weak or there's not a lot of good intention for a good, strong vertical downward pull, the diaphragm can actually kind of just stay flat and go down a little bit, but it's not pulling the lungs down, it's really pulling them wider. And then the lungs tend to fill upward into the chest rather than becoming two nice long, what we're looking for is nice long vertically extended lungs filling with air that come down into the gut cavity here as we're pulling down on the inhale, right? So this is what we're going to experiment with on the inhale exercises in a moment. And I think that's it. Why don't we move on to some exercises here and we'll explain some more as we're doing them. Okay, let's set up to do just some really simple breathing exercises, emphasizing the inhale. So just remember from the last video, we want to set up a basic good posture to begin with. So just relax, shake things off, stand up, please, if you can. And remember, we can bang on the heels a little bit so that our hip and pelvis get nice and flush and vertical and don't tip back or forward. Okay, and then imagine we have this little rope here pulling up on the back of our head and kind of stretching us out through the spinal column as well as the back of the neck. Okay, keep the chest open and the shoulders back. And we're going to talk about inhale. I'm going to be talking, but what I'd like you to do is also what we're going to prepare kind of the mouth posture, the jaw posture. Let's breathe. Let's do these exercises, inhaling and exhaling through the nose. Okay. So what I want you to do is essentially follow this is lips together, teeth together, tongue to the roof of your mouth. And we'll speak actually quite a bit more about this in the section on the resonator, but lips together, teeth together, tongue to the roof of your mouth. Teeth can be nearly together. You don't want them grinding, but get your posture set. Keep your mouth closed. Keep the tongue nice and firmly placed on especially the front half or the front third of the roof of the mouth. Now, as you're doing that, let's do something. Just start inhaling and exhaling. Let me do one. Okay, so the first exercise we're going to do is going to help us understand the difference between two primary ways of breathing. And we'll call one of them from the bottom up and the other from the top down. So let's start with top down breathing. Okay, so what I want you to do is take a full inhale and exhale cycle. But what I want you to do is, as you inhale, I want you to fill up, imagine and feel that you're filling up the top of the chest first. And what we're going to do is take a really deep breath, much bigger breath than you would take preparing to sing a phrase. Take as big a breath as you can. Try to fill this up first. And when this feels kind of full, keep forcing air into the inhale and see how it kind of grows downward. Okay, so I'm going to do two of them. Okay, so that's filling the chest first, and then as it becomes full, the air naturally wants to move downward, and we're starting to fill, the lungs are moving down and filling up below. So now let's do the opposite. Let's just focus your mind on filling the lower portion. It feels like you're filling the gut, even though the lungs are up here, and the lungs are being pulled down into the gut. But what I'm after is pulling that diaphragm down, even if you can't consciously do it, imagining that you're pulling down and breathing down into the gut such that you feel this pressure of the lower contents of the gut wanting to expand because the lungs and the diaphragm are pushing down on it. So I want you to take an inhale, fill that first, and once that's full and it can't go anywhere else, continue to inhale so you feel the air now filling up vertically toward the chest. I'll just do one here for myself. So what happens is we've now just demonstrated. Feel free at any time to stop the video. These are great exercises to do all the time. They're silent exercises, so if you have an issue with roommates or family or children or neighbors where you can't make a lot of noise, breathing exercises are very important, and a great thing about them is they tend to be silent. So what you want to do is learn that difference, because between the two ways of inhaling, the way we want when we're making sound as a singer or a voice actor is we want to breathe down first. We want to breathe deep and down into the lower gut. And we want to feel that pressure. We want to feel the muscle, the base of the diaphragm muscle, as it gets pulled down, we want to feel it contracting. So what happens when you breathe in real deep, I'll do it with my mouth because I'm speaking, you'll feel not only this pressure building up at the base of the gut from all this downward movement, you're going to feel a little bit of muscle tightening in the base of the spine. Well, that's the diaphragm reaching its full extent. So it's much like, it's a contracting muscle like your bicep. So as you flex your bicep all the way, you feel that bunching up and that contracting. Well, you should feel that when your diaphragm's pulled down to about its maximum length down at the bottom. So this one exercise, and we'll just move right into another exercise that's very similar. This is all about the inhale and the different ways to take an inhale. So let's now just work on breathing in this downward motion, okay? Because there's still a number of ways to do this. So let's try breathing. And again, you can pause the video. I'm going to do it a few times here, but I don't want you to spend too much time watching me breathe. Is that what I want you to do now is breathe down, as we just did, but do it 3 different ways on 3 consecutive cycles of breath. Do one where you're breathing down, where it feels like you're kind of breathing down and diagonally forward. Kind of like what people say, breathe into the belly, and you feel like, again, that the breathing is not going straight down, but it's going forward. On the second breath, go ahead and breathe down, straight down. Imagine you almost feel like a concrete column, just going straight down the middle. And then on the third breath, see if you can breathe down, but at a slightly backward angle. Okay? I'm going to do 3, but I'm going to do them a little faster. Normally I do them long and deep, okay? But I want to do it for myself. So go ahead and do this yourself. Okay. And again, you can stop the video. This is a great exercise to simply, because it's one way of showing that there may not be exactly one correct way to inhale. My preference is to go, and I've experimented with this quite often when I'm doing exercises or when I'm singing, is that I don't like to breathe downward and forward into the belly and blow the belly open. Again, as we spoke about earlier, that people have a tendency when they do that to tip the pelvis back, to let the muscle core of the abdomen completely relax and go flaccid, and the belly expands, and you lose your good posture and alignment, which can throw you forward and the head back, and it messes up everything. So what I think, if there's a takeaway I want you to have on this inhale lesson, is to realize that, again, get your posture up and going, is that when you inhale, even though you're filling this area down and you're feeling this outward pressure, there's no obvious bloated expansion and rounding of the gut and the belly, other than a little bit of natural firmness and expansion that comes from, again, this pushing down or pulling down of the diaphragm and the lungs above them that kind of squish those guts. This is actually, I'm going to have a guest on at some point in time, but this is actually how your body pumps a lot of its lymphatic fluid through the body, is you have a lot of lymph glands under here. And so the breathing acts as a pump. So this is actually very healthy for you too, is that if your diaphragm is very strong and you're breathing nice and downward into the gut, is that you're pumping those lymph glands and helping to circulate the lymph through your body. So this is actually very healthy for you as well to breathe this way. But what I want you to take away from this is, on that inhale, experiment with it. You'll be experimenting with for years, but begin to build this into your preparation and the things you keep in your awareness as you're training and singing, is that you want to breathe downward. You want to feel that pressure. You're going to feel a little bit of the diaphragm muscle in the final stages of its contraction. And I tend to want to feel not only downward, but a little bit backwards. And I think that's because it's somewhat accurate, because I suspect that because the diaphragm muscle is connected to the spinal column, that it can't really pull perfectly vertically down, that it's actually pulling slightly backwards as it's contracting. And even though the lungs may actually themselves be coming slightly at an angle, not straight down, but slightly down at a backwards angle. And I actually find that when I imagine myself breathing in that way, that usually puts me in the best position to make sound. It does. It definitely does. So you're not breathing forward into the gut, but try it. I mean, again, this is all for you to experiment with. Anything that a coach or an instructor can do to you is try to describe as best they can with his imagery what's happening, but your responsibility is to try it in all these different ways and learn how it feels. And then as you're making sound, see which way is actually helping you make the sound the best. Not only the best sound, but with the least amount of stress, with the least amount of pressure and constriction. So just go ahead, remember, get your posture straight, and let's talk about, so one of the things we'll talk about this more in the exhale, but just something I'll plant a seed here is, when you take that nice big deep inhale, straight down or slightly backwards from straight down, Notice how your chest still, as you take about a 2/3 to a 3/4 breath, sort of a full breath, but not a maximum breath. Notice how your shoulders still want to stay down and your chest stays nice and high and open. Because what happens is when we exhale, quite often you hear a phrase, something like you exhale on the body position of the inhale. So when you, at the top of your inhale, you want to exhale without letting this collapse. Okay, you want to stay in the inhale position, the full inhale position through the exhale. And we'll talk about that. Actually, it would be in the next video, in the exhale video. But keep this in mind, is that the posture when you're at the height of your breath, of the inhale, the height of the inhale, that's, you want to take a good command of that. What are you feeling down here in the gut? What pressure are you feeling around here? Is your belly super extended or not? If it's super extended, is there any pressure in the curve of your back from possibly the pelvic tipping forward? Or is your head coming forward or the head up? These are all aspects of breathing posture. So again, breathe down and learn to feel all those sensations, and practice a number of different breath cycles, and practice breathing slightly forward into the belly, maybe back and diagonally, or straight back into the back, straight down, and just get a feel for how that happens while keeping all this open and up and the posture good. Okay, so now we're going to move on to talking about the transition to exhale. Okay, so moving right along, we've just talked about how to take a nice big inhale, how we have a few different ways we can take the inhale, but we haven't yet got to the point where we're ready to make sound, because when we exhale, a lot of the muscles in the lungs are already moving in the other direction. So how do we transition from that inhale to the exhale and sound making properly without losing all this great stuff that we've just set up on the inhale? Because what can happen is, again, with a beginner or someone who hasn't been taught in this way, is that they get that nice inhale in there and they kind of go straight to exhale, but they relax a lot of that, or they let it go. So once again, stand up and establish good posture. And these are, again, exercises that you'll need to pause the video or after the video's over to repeat, until you really understand this feeling. And it's a very simple thing. It's amazing how something so small can be so important. But what happens is, on the exhale, where you would think that you would want the feeling of things moving upward, these muscles here moving back and moving upward, it's actually not what we're after. What we want to try to do is maintain that downward feeling, that feeling of pulling down. Some people like to call it pushing down. I prefer the feeling of pulling it down through the exhale. So what happens is, when we transition to the exhale, we've just finished this really nice pulling down, straight down or slightly backward, whatever method you determine is best for you on the inhale. And we don't want to let that go. So what we have is this downward movement and this feeling of downward pressure. And as we transition from this to the exhale, the feeling of transition is basically a momentary pause without letting go of this. In a way, you're either pausing or you're even continuing to push down or pull down this downward feeling and downward motion as you enter the exhale, whereby you will continue with that downward pulling feeling. So take I'm going to do a couple here so you don't have to pause the video. You can do them with me. Then you can pause the video afterward if you want. Get your posture ready. Take a nice, big, deep inhale, like we talked about in the last video. And right when you're at the maximum point of the inhale, not 100%, we're taking about a 2/3 to 3/4 breath. And we're keeping this all nice and open, shoulders relaxed. And then as you transition to the exhale, don't let any of this come back up. If anything, continue more with that downward motion. So I'm just going to do a couple here. I'm going to breathe through my nose. Okay. So well, the video's almost over, but I would say right after this video, take a few moments. If you're not already familiar with this, take a few moments to do this and experiment with this. And of course, in the next video, we're going to be talking about the exhale primarily, and then a brief bit about the transition back to inhale. And of course, as you're doing this transition, you already moved to exhale. So even right now, before the next video, take a nice deep inhale. Continue as you transition to exhale. Don't let any of that downward feeling, that downward pressure go. And you're going to actually feel, I mean, it's pretty obvious once you practice this a lot, that you just kind of feel this continuing downward motion during the transition as well as during the exhale. So we'll cover the exhale more in a minute, but for the purpose of practicing in between these two videos, go ahead and push down, and then on the exhale, still feel that downward motion, and we'll elaborate on that in a minute. So to recap this section on the inhale, we talked about the purpose of the singer's phrase in general is we want to make sure through the entire phrase of inhaling and then making sound on the exhale that the advanced students, to develop mastery of singing and voice acting, is that we have to begin each phrase active and in the right position so that we start correctly and we're not playing catch up. And then we maintain all the proper coordination and activation through the very, very end of the exhale till we're not making sound. Beginners have a tendency to start incorrectly and finish incorrectly. Okay, we talked about the diaphragm being this kind of umbrella-like muscle that gets flipped upside down because it pulls itself down and it pushes the contents of the gut down and they expand. And so we want to feel that downward pressure. We want to feel the pressure of the guts wanting to kind of bump up and expand out in the lower gut region, and the contraction of that diaphragm muscle as it finishes its full range of motion in the downward motion. Okay, and so we're preparing for the exhale. So we want to pull straight down, and we want to prepare for that transition by continuing to pull down and not letting any of this great work we did to prepare this, plus our posture, for the exhale. Okay, so that is our quick video or our lesson on the inhale and the transition to inhale. And we're going to move now onto the exhale. Okay.